Good morning, ladies. Good morning. The lights are really bright today, so if I'm kind of going like this, just have empathy for me. All right, so we are continuing on in our journey in the Gospels. And I am excited today to introduce our next gospel to you today, which is Luke. But before I do, let's do some really quick review. I want to refer you to Revelation chapter 4, verse 7. So, sometime this week, go back and read that passage in Revelation, which is actually a quotation from an Old Testament book, which is pretty exciting. But basically, in Revelation, we see a picture of the four faces of this heavenly vision. And a lot of scholars over time, and even going back to the earliest church fathers, associate the four different images as symbols for the four different gospels and the four different pictures that those gospels paint of Jesus. So, in the light of those four images that we find in Revelation chapter 4 verse 7, Matthew, if you might recall, represents Jesus as the Lion of Judah because Matthew addressed the Jews, and Matthew was deliberately tying in Jesus as Messiah to the Davidic covenant, right? To the covenant that God made with David. So again, Matthew addressed a Jewish audience. And then we have Mark that we just finished up talking about. And in Mark, most people think that Jesus is presented as the ox because Mark really presents the strength and the power of Jesus. And this was important because Mark was addressing primarily a Roman audience, and the Romans were all about action and strength and power, right? So it was very appropriate for Mark to do that. Now we're coming to Luke. And Luke is the third of what we call our synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three synoptics, which means similar. Okay? Now, Luke is going to present Jesus as the image of man. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. So, why does Luke emphasize Jesus as man? Well, because Luke really emphasizes Jesus' humanity. He was God, but he was also human. And Luke brings out just the strength of Jesus as a man of compassion. As we read Luke, we're just going to see the love of Christ and the compassion of Christ pour through towards the different people that he interacts with. We're going to see how Jesus reached out to the poor, to the unwelcome, to the marginalized. And we're going to talk more about that again here in a little bit. So, who is our author? Well, surprising, it's Luke, right? But who was Luke? Luke was a Gentile, which is surprising. And he was a doctor, he was a physician. So he was well educated, very intelligent. Now, some things that is helpful to know about Luke is that he never actually met Jesus. So he became a believer after Christ's ascension. Now, part of what's helpful to understand about Luke is that he was a companion of Paul and he was very loyal to Paul and he learned a lot from Paul. Now, as I mentioned before, he was a doctor, so he's very well educated. But Luke wrote his gospel using the highest form of Greek language. You know, in English, we have slang, right? We have casual language, and then we have more formal language. Well, it was the same in ancient Greece, except in ancient Greece, they really valued intelligence and having these deep conversations and having secret knowledge. So, Luke used the highest form of Greek language, whereas Mark, surprisingly, not, used the simplest form of Greek because Mark was all about the action. He was a sports writer. Just give me the score, baby. I just want to know who won this little conflict, right? That's what Mark was all about. Luke is the only Gentile writer in the Bible, in our canonized Bible. Surprisingly, most people don't realize that Dr. Luke, wrote 28% of the New Testament. So he was a very significant contributor to the New Testament. And we think that he wrote this probably in the second half of AD 60, the second half of that decade. Now, who was Luke's audience? Well, we have different layers of audiences in this gospel, but the first one we discover in the first few verses of this gospel. And it was this man named Theophilus. Try to say that quickly without a lisp. Theophilus. So, who was Theophilus? Theophilus was a wealthy benefactor. So most people believe that he was an official. He was wealthy, but he held some official office. But he okay, I just lost my train of thought. This does happen sometimes. It's okay. Jesus still loves me. So, um thank you. Thank you. So Theophilus meant friend of God, right? And so we think that he was the man that was paying for all the expenses that Luke incurred to do his research and to write his gospel. Now, so there was Theophilus, which he was presenting this official report to. But then, at a more important level, the audience was the Gentile Christian, not the Jewish Christian, but the Gentile Christian, which is appropriate because Luke is a Gentile. And by the way, what's a Gentile? Anybody that's not a Jew, right? Okay. So, why was he writing to the Gentile Christians? Well, he's a Gentile and he's sensitive to the fact that a lot of Gentiles were really doubtful about this whole Jewish heritage thing. It was well understood that the Jewish leaders did not think that Jesus was the Messiah. They were not supportive, and in fact, they rejected Jesus as Messiah. Okay? So there was that. And then we find in here that as Luke addresses this Gentile audience, we find that he takes time to explain some background which would help us understand why were the Jewish leaders rejecting Jesus as Messiah. So Luke explains that, and that's very helpful. And then he explains why and how it was always in God's plan to offer salvation to the Gentile, which, if you know much about Jewish or Old Testament history, we know that the Jewish leaders were not at all happy about the gospel being offered to Gentiles. I hope you guys are following me. I know I'm throwing out a lot of cultural words and phrases here. Now, it also appears that Luke was thinking about the entire Gentile world, not just Gentile Christians, because of the way he wrote using this classic form of Greek literature. He was really appealing to that Greek mind that worshiped the intellect and thought that if you were really intelligent, you had secret and special knowledge. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's talk about context. So, what was happening within the growing New Testament church that Luke seemed to be concerned about as he wrote this gospel? Well, I've mentioned this already, but this was a really important thing, and that was a very comprehensive rejection of Jesus by the Jewish leaders. It was very concerning, very disheartening. And then there was a growing number of Gentile converts to the faith. There was also, if you were going to follow Christ, you should expect and be certain that you were going to suffer. You should expect to face a lot of suffering. So Luke was aware of that and concerned about this. This was also around the time, some historians call it the Neronian Holocaust. It's when Nero was brutally murdering followers of Christ. And at this time, he was responsible for the murder of both Paul and Peter. So it was a very hard time, a very sad time. Now, the New Testament church was growing and spreading, but it was really only spreading and growing in Gentile regions. It was not growing and spreading in Jewish regions. So, again, this all motivated Luke's writing this as a Gentile, really reaching out to Gentiles. Luke also wrote from eyewitness accounts and got a lot of his material from the stories that had been passed down or passed around by Jesus' original disciples. Now, what's the purpose of our book? We know that all the Gospels are biological sketches of Jesus, right? So, why do we need Luke? If we have three others, what was Luke's purpose? Well, we find it very succinctly stated in chapter 1, verse 4, which says, so that you may know the certainty. I think your notes say certainly, but it's certainty of the things that you've been taught. So Luke very much wants to imbue a confidence in the people that were already following Jesus or the people that were considering following Jesus. Luke wanted to reassure Christians and help establish them both in their faith, but also in their theology. The Gentiles probably had some pretty weird theology because remember, Gentiles were their faith was really based in a polytheistic belief, which means many, they worshipped many idols. So Luke had a lot of correcting to do. It's like to say, no, there's not all these different idols. There's one God, and his name is Yahweh. All right, moving on. Um, Also, part of the purpose of Luke's writing was to really bring out the truth that God had kept his covenant promises from the Old Testament. And there's lots of beautiful ties in Luke back to God's Old Testament covenant promises. He's also showing through his gospel that Christ walks out God's covenant love. God is a covenant love, and we see that through Jesus' growing church and the number of Gentiles that are coming to Christ, even though Christ is now dead but yet risen and ascended back to heaven. All right, Luke also focuses the spotlight on people thrown to the side. So this is a really important thing to Luke. Luke was such a man of compassion, and he wanted the world to know back then and today still that Jesus always stood up for those that were rejected. So that means the poor, the crippled, the outcast, the lepers, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, women. Women were not highly respected or regarded back then. And we see in Luke some really touching retelling of how Jesus reached out to the demon possessed and he loved them and he healed them. I love that. I love that. Luke also thoroughly demonstrates how God, through Jesus, deliberately reached out to the Gentiles and invited them into God's kingdom. Ladies, that's us. Some of you might be Jewish in here, but I'm guessing that most of you living in North Idaho in America in 2024 are Gentiles. So be really thankful that Jesus reached out to the Gentile and invited them. Now, obviously, if you understand Jewish history at this point, the Jews were not happy about this. Remember, the Jews were like, no, 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 we're the chosen people, and you Gentiles, we don't care about you. God didn't choose you, he just chose us. Well, it was both and. He chose the Jews, and he also called out to the Gentiles. And for that, you and I owe our very lives, right? Okay, now the main themes. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Main themes. The first one is pretty obvious. Salvation is offered to the whole world. The whole world. That means everybody, even the people you don't like, okay? Even the nations that you might today see as our enemies, God still offers salvation to terrorists, to people that we have strong disagreements with. This is a huge theme in Luke. Second one is Jesus' humanity. Luke clearly presents Jesus as both Son of God and Son of Man, fully God and at the same time fully human, which, if you're going, it makes no sense, you're right. It makes no sense. We in our humanity cannot comprehend that. It is a mystery of God. Um, Part of Jesus' humanity that Luke looks at is the what we call the infancy narrative. Luke includes the most detailed history of Jesus from birth into young childhood. And that is invaluable. That's Luke is the most trusted source to learn about Jesus's birth and early childhood in the whole world. All cultures go to Luke for that. Another big theme is Jesus' love for people. It just pours through the pages of Luke. So you're going to enjoy that. Fourth, really big theme is the Holy Spirit. I love how often Luke uses phrases like the Spirit, led by the Spirit, empowered by the Spirit. The Spirit was present for. So if you have any doubt about the third part of the Trinity being the Holy Spirit, Luke should just really clear that doubt up. The Holy Spirit was vital to salvation in the gospel story of Luke, and the Holy Spirit is vital. There's some sub themes. The first is prayer. Luke is unique in that it includes more information on Jesus praying and teaching his disciples to pray than any of the other gospels. Also, the role of the temple. Now, the temple is really important because of its tie to the Old Testament. And what did the temple represent in the Old Testament? The presence of God. Well, now the presence of God in the form of Jesus has come. He's here amongst us. But Luke understands that the temple still was vital to the Jews and seen as a vital place of religion in the whole world. And so he needed to keep that connection. So Luke will tell a lot of stories that happen, a lot of events that occur in and around the temple. And then finally, praise is a subtheme. There are 4 hymns in the first 2 chapters of Luke. The most well known is the Magnificat, which is Mary's praise and worship of God. Take time to soak that in while you read it. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So, Magnificat, by the way, means to magnify. To magnify. Now, what are some unique characteristics of Luke? Well, it's the longest of the 4 Gospels, so you will be reading more. So don't be lazy. Start today. It's worth it. It's really a great read. It is the only Gospel with a sequel. Did you know that? So Luke should be considered Luke 1, and its sequel, Acts, the book of Acts, should be considered Luke 2. And ideally, now, who am I to question our early church fathers? But I kind of wonder, why didn't they do John and then Luke so we could go straight from Luke into Acts? Because really, we should read Luke and Acts together, because Acts is just a continuation of Luke's telling the story of Jesus and Jesus' ongoing ministry. I'm telling you, if you've struggled with Acts like I did for a few decades of my Christian walk, once I read Luke and immediately went to Acts, boy, light bulbs just went off. So in all your spare time, while you're reading Luke, and when we go to John, read John and Acts. All right, another unique characteristic is that Luke does really extensive research in his presentation of Jesus's early life. And if you want to know how he did that, there's some great information out there about how he interviewed eyewitnesses and he recorded stories from people that were actually there at the stories that Luke is going to tell in his gospel. Luke is known as the great humanitarian gospel. or the gospel of compassion. And that will come through loud and clear when you read this. Luke also extensively quotes from Isaiah and the Psalms. So it's really helpful if you read those cross references as you go through Luke. Now, Luke also has more parables. We were talking at my in my group this morning about parables. Parables were difficult. They're just not easy to understand, but they were really well accepted and frequently used in that age and culture. Remember, that was a storytelling culture. It was an oral culture. People, uh, a lot of people didn't read, and you didn't have, like, we can go to the library and check out a book. Well, they had to have a connection to the temple and go check out a scroll, and a lot of people didn't know how to read that scroll anyway. So storytelling was huge, and Jesus loved to tell parables because they were based on metaphors of things that were physically right there in the immediate vicinity of the people that Jesus was talking to. The important thing to, if you can understand it without going into a lot of information about this, remember that parables come from two base words that mean conceal and reveal. So when Jesus told parables, he was deliberately concealing things from those that were hard of heart. And he was spiritually revealing things to those who were soft of heart and wanted to follow Jesus and believed in him. So, admittedly, parables take some work, but Jesus was really good when the disciples said, we don't get it. Would you explain? He explained, and the Holy Spirit can help you understand as well. All right. Let's see. Moving on to structure. There's always 20 ways to break down any book of the Bible. I could give you any number of outlines, but I like one that I got from Charles Swindoll, who's one of my heroes of the faith. And Charles Swindoll takes his outline of Luke from the key verse of Luke, which is chapter 19, verse 10, which says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So Swindoll breaks it down into three main parts. He came, he came, he came. He was born. He had a childhood. We have history about that. That's the first part of Luke. The second part is he came to seek. He sought. He picked disciples. He had a following develop, and he started training and preparing those disciples to do his work and to carry out his message. And then the last part of Luke is Jesus saves. He fulfilled the mission that he came to do. He gave his life on the cross. He was resurrected. He ascended. He accomplished what he set out to do. He paid the price once and for all for sin, for your sin and my sin. And I've given you the chapter references on that. Now, just really quick notes on the first 12 chapters of Luke. The first 4 chapters of Luke really look at Jesus' earthly beginnings. And it's really important to note how Luke ties Jesus to Israel and to the Old Testament. And I've given you 4 examples here that I'm going to let you read on your own. But it's really exciting to me when I take the time to dig in and see how specific stories in the Gospels immediately point back. Like, for example, Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mom, she was old. She hadn't been able to have a baby. Well, who does that make us think of in the Old Testament? Hannah, right? So there's all sorts of beautiful ties. That's not coincidental. If you take the time to read those Old Testament cross references, you're going to be really encouraged, and you're going to see how our 3 R's, our 3 threads, just carry through so clearly. And in Luke, it's especially encouraging because you see R1, which is God reveals himself to man, and R3, God redeems man back to himself. That just connects the Old Testament to the New so beautifully. Now, in these first 12 chapters, look for a theme of poverty because it's very prevalent in Jesus' early life. And ask yourself, why does Luke bring this out? And why is that important? It's really important for you and I today. In the early chapters, also note the important ties between Jesus and his cousin, John the Baptist, because that is also a really important tie to Old Testament prophecy. Now, Luke is generally organized regionally or geographically. We've said this a lot in WOW. The Bible typically is not concerned about writing any individual book chronologically. That's more of a Western linear thought thing. That was not how the culture thought or wrote or told stories back then. It was more thematic back then. But Luke, because Luke is super methodical, he decides, well, I'll organize this gospel around regions. So he starts the book with Jesus's Galilean ministry. What was happening around Galilee? And then he ends it on what did Jesus do around Jerusalem? So again, don't try to make it chronological because that wasn't Luke's intent. Now, finally, let's see, are we ready for final? Yes, we better be. Okay, so the end of Luke, the chapters 9 through 12, look for Jesus' very deliberate training of his disciples in, surprisingly, discipleship. There's all sorts of ways in those last few chapters that you're going to read this week where Jesus is teaching them that being a disciple of Christ doesn't just mean following him, it means being changed by him and doing what he would do. And that's what we're called to today, right? Now, in summary, I want to encourage you when you come to the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, verse 46. Put yourself in Mary's shoes. Mary was probably 13 years old. She was from a tiny little village in Israel. Tiny. Now, what do we know when you live in a tiny little town? Everybody knows you. They all know mama and daddy, and when you act up, mom and daddy are going to find out because it's a small village. To be 13, to be unwed, to be a good Jewish girl, this to be pregnant in that circumstance, catastrophic. Grounds to be killed, to be stoned to death. And I want you to think about that when you read the Magnificat. I hope it challenges you and I hope it encourages you. And I've given you some going deeper questions to read to help you as you study this week. Thank you.